Hey all, I'm your host Cryptic. Welcome back to the channel, or welcome for the first time to the channel. And we've got a new game discussion video on today. Sorry I haven't been around for a few months making videos. Moving, work, everything else has just been completely hectic, and things have finally settled down to a point where I can return and start making videos again about the games, tech, and everything else that I like discussing on the channel. As you can see from the title of the video, we're going to be talking about Nintendo today. You've probably seen a million videos on it, but in saying that, I feel like I've got a bit of a unique take on the whole situation that we're going to discuss today. And yeah, let's have a good discussion about it and see if we can get a more solid point of view on what's going on in the world of Nintendo. So, unless you've been living under a rock, let's say in the last week or so, Nintendo did finally announce the new Switch model. No, it wasn't the rumored Switch Pro, but it did have an OLED screen like the supposed Switch Pro was going to have. But yeah, they did a bare minimum upgrade, as what a lot of people online would be saying. A lot of angry Nintendo fans that are divided between wanting a upgraded Switch and those who don't care and tend to play more handheld on their Switch, more handheld than docked, and they're happy with upgrading, and those that just aren't interested. So it seems to be a lot of mixed emotions about Nintendo's announcement. But in today's video, I sort of want to bring a perspective to sort of make sense and understand why they did what they did, why they did what they did, and most likely, in my point of view, why they possibly made the best choice, albeit they needed to do one or two other things to round that decision up to really make it stand out. So yeah, let's get into it. So the rumored Switch Pro, which was for the last 2 years, I'd say at least minimum of the rumors floating around and reports supposedly coming in, despite Nintendo denying any new hardware revisions coming out, other than the original hardware revision on the Switch, which was the V2 version with the upgraded battery life through the upgraded Tegra chip that's in there from Nvidia, and the Switch Lite, which is a handheld only variant. They decided to do the Nintendo Switch OLED in parentheses because that's how the marketing is when you want to look this up and pre-order it, or just even look it up anywhere. So it's the Nintendo Switch OLED. New screen, it's now gone from a 6.2 inch LCD display for the handheld to a 7 inch OLED display. Instead of the standard 32 gigabytes internal storage, they've bumped that up to 64 gigabytes. And a slightly updated dock, which from my understanding and research, and I'll probably try and link some articles below that back this up, you can actually buy the new dock separate if you have the current Switch. If you don't use the USB port, because they've also replaced the USB port with a fixed Ethernet connection, so you're not forced to only connect to the internet via Wi-Fi. You can do a hard connection, which in my opinion doesn't really make too much sense, because you want to seamlessly transition from dock to handheld if you want to carry a game. If you're going out, you're not at home anymore and you're going somewhere, and just continue like by going somewhere around, walking around the house or playing or moving to another room, and you don't want to go from a fixed to Wi-Fi, but maybe the connection switching's pretty good compared like to the current consoles, etc. Because usually if you play on the PlayStation, for example, you have to set up for one or the other. You can't set up for two things. So if one disconnects, it doesn't automatically connect to the other one, etc. But anyway, that's beside the point. So those are the main upgrades, and depending on what region you live in, it's anywhere from $50 to about $100 price difference. I think here it's about $80 in Australia as a price variation from the current Switch to the OLED version. Saying that, we do now have a Switch at home. We got ours during the Amazon Prime deals a few weeks back, and yeah, got it for a steal. No regrets, obviously, with the announcement, even though the Pro was in the back of the head that it could be a thing. I mean, at the price that it was going for, it was a no-brainer. It was an easy pickup. But does leave fans disappointed that wanted the spec bump, because if you've seen some recent open world games announced and launched on the Switch, their performance is something left to be desired, where it's dropping frames below 30 frames per second, lowered resolution where you can tell it's not playing at native 1080p, which is a lot more noticeable compared to, for example, playing at native 4K and upscale to 4K. It's not as noticeable compared to having upscale 1080p, where the difference between 720 and 1080p is night and day. So a lot of people were disappointed and were hoping that, even if it wasn't, I guess, 4K, they wanted at least a stable 30 or 60, because even a lot of Nintendo games in the past were always very well optimized, at least hit 60 frames per second, especially with the Nintendo style, visual style on a lot of their games, which are very appealing to a wide market, and you're getting butter smooth frame rates. But unfortunately, lately the Switch is not, I wouldn't say so often with first party. You get a lot with third party, where you'd have frame pacing issues, etc., like the Witcher being ported to the Switch, or Doom, or the Crysis remaster, etc., etc. Yes, Crysis running on a Switch, when not too long ago that was a meme, like, can it run Crysis, and burning up PCs. That a lot of fans wanted that. They just wanted consistent performance, where they were, a smooth experience that they could have on handheld or docked and not be dropping frames. Which, to be fair, that isn't really asking too much, considering that instead of Nintendo just superseding the existing one, which seems like that'll happen, they'll slowly phase out their existing V2 model for only the OLED, and that'll be the only one you can pick up on the market. But it is dearer. Like I said, it's depending on region, it's $50 to $100 more. But in saying that, I do defend Nintendo on their decision to not go with a full spec bump internally. With the current climate of chip shortages happening around the world, scalping, how popular a lot of computer and tech is now during the pandemic compared to how it was before, devices are flying off the shelves, and Switches now are flying off the shelves. They've sold 20 million Switches in one financial year, in the most recent one, and it doesn't seem like it's slowing down. It's beaten the 360 and PS3 in sales. It'll definitely beat the Wii. Will it beat the PS4 even? It has every chance to do so, as long as they keep supporting it with a whole bunch of great games. The attach rate of games on the Switch is through the roof. Most first-party titles sell between 10 and 20 million plus, easy. Which I don't know about Microsoft, and well, definitely not Microsoft now, because they've gone with the Game Pass route. But even with PlayStation, yeah, they'll sell 10 or 20, but usually that would be the peak. You look at games on the Switch, there's a bunch that are at 30, 40, 50 million copies, which is an insane attach rate per console. They have probably their highest software attach rate for any generation console that they've ever sort of had, considering that the Wii U was a commercial failure for them, and rightfully so. That was terribly marketed and just, didn't make any sense. But with that, changing the LCD to an OLED, that could have been a supply constraint, where they saw that the LCD technology they were using was being phased out by their suppliers, and it was going to be harder to get Switches into stores and get into people's hands, considering at the rate they're selling at. So they changed it to an easy to get OLED that does what they want. I mean, again, OLED's good, more vibrant colors, more accurate color reproduction. Why not? Yes, it's not a resolution bump, it's still a 720p OLED, but hey, it's OLED nonetheless. 64 gig instead of 32 gig internal memory. Again, more memory the better, but you're still going to get that micro SD card, because that internal memory is just not going to be enough, especially if you download a handful of digital games. And replacing the USB port with the Ethernet connection. So yeah, I mean, if you ever use the 8-bit Pro or 8-bit little USB, if you want to connect third-party control like your PlayStation controller or the Bluetooth Xbox controller to your Switch, you won't be able to do that unless, I guess, you get an Ethernet to USB adapter dongle, as opposed to the USB to the Ethernet that everyone's using now. But yeah, Nintendo doing what they normally do. The last major, I guess, hardware update they ever really did, like mid-gen, was the new 3DS with the extra analog stick, as opposed to having one that had two, and only certain games were playable only on the newest version of the 3DS. I guess they didn't want to go through that confusion again in their market and fan base, so they decided, hey, everything's still the same. In saying that, I hear the outcries for better frame rates, not so much but just solid frame rates for the games. A lot of people say, hey, Nvidia used the existing Switch chip in the Nvidia Shield, and it does 4K, all that. You gotta think about it this way: the Nvidia Shield that's using, yes, the same chip, is clocked higher, has more cooling to allow for the increased heat production of it being clocked higher. And it's not playing games natively. It's not playing PC games natively on it to 4K. It's streaming video to 4K, video files to 4K. It's streaming PC games and upscaling and using DLSS to 4K. It's not playing them natively. So with saying that, there was almost no chance that even if it did have DLSS and the total clock overclock done to it to get it to the Shield speeds, that it was going to do 4K. And you can see how much Nintendo priced the Nintendo Switch OLED model now. It's it's extra $50 to $100 depending on your region to the existing Switch model. Could you imagine if it was 4K? Look at the PS5 and the Xbox Series X, how much they cost, the type of hardware they have in them, and how they're doing 4K. Could you imagine how much a Switch would cost, where it would have to be a hybrid console that would still pump out 4K? It would be technically more expensive, considering all the very unique hardware and components that are used to be able to make it a hybrid machine. And it would have to get way thicker to be able to dissipate all that heat, even with the clock speeds. If you look at Digital Foundry, I'd say about in the last 10 months, they did several videos of overclocking the existing chip to fix frame rate issues, and it did work, but they did note the heat output of the Switch was insane. So you'd be degrading the life of the silicon on that very quickly. It's not designed to be running at those clock speeds. Yes, developers can access minor boost increases during development, but not the total 100% potential of the chip, because unfortunately the chassis of the Switch does not dissipate enough heat to allow it to hit those clock speeds. It will thermal throttle quite easily. But in saying that, it would have been good if Nintendo did a firmware update that allowed the chipset on the Switch to allow the chipset to just, I guess, unlock the frequency, not 24/7 all the time, but when it's needed. Like, if we know how the PS5 works, it tends to, developers can boost the GPU and CPU and regulate between what needs more power depending on what's seen in a video game. I think if Nintendo did something like that, they wouldn't need to do a whole new revision of the Switch. They could keep the existing model that we have now and the OLED and just do a firmware update to allow the frequencies to, instead of being locked to what they are now, to unlock them, because it's just software controlled. I do not believe that it's hardware limited, it's software limited, and for those overheating reasons. But if the system itself could just detect that it needed a little bit more CPU or a little more GPU in a scene to maintain a rock solid 30 or 60 FPS, whatever the game is targeting, I think that would alleviate a lot of the problems that our current Switch owners have. Playing games like at the moment that we have on the Switch, like Mario Kart, etc., they're fine. They run no problem. But there are, like Zelda Breath of the Wild, especially the sequel coming up, the new open world Pokemon, I think that's Pokemon Arceus coming out. People could see the trailers and they were hiccuping, and people asked, are we sure that the Switch as is now could actually maintain these at solid frame rates, and we're not going to have, you know, a sword and shield fiasco where you go to a particular part of the map and it just chugs to like 10 frames a second. So yeah, I think Nintendo did the right call to be able to maintain quantity of hardware in retailers and into consumer hands, but they needed to do a little bit more. Even if they were going to ask for an extra $50, I think just unlocking the firmware to be able to, I guess, turbo boost the frequencies when needed, not all the time, but when needed, so the Switch could actually maintain it. Because if you look at the new dock, it has more, I guess, cooling grills on it where it never had before. It doesn't have it now. So yeah, don't know why they're doing that. There's never been any reports of Switches overheating, especially in docked mode. So it's interesting that they've done that, but they've confirmed it's the same chipset at the same frequencies. Everything is the same except for the Ethernet port, the 64 gigs of internal storage over the 32, and the OLED screen. Is it worth the new price tag? If you don't have a Switch and you're really looking to get one, I say get the V2. Unless handheld gaming is everything, I still don't think the extra money is actually worth it, to be honest. You're not that far. I think getting a Xbox Series S is cheaper, and unless you're diehards playing Nintendo games, I'd say that would be better value over the new Switch. It's not that far off of getting a PS5 digital edition, which is the same spec other than no Blu-ray drive compared to the standard edition PS5. And I guess the Series X either. But yeah, it's interesting because Nintendo's always made their money on not being the most expensive console, but being the most interesting with a great library of first-party titles, because that's why you buy a Switch, to play the first-party Nintendo titles. But yeah, I think for creature comforts, for end-user happiness, they should have at least said, along with this new OLED one, we're announcing a new firmware update that unlocks the Tegra chip to be able to maintain solid 30 FPS in all upcoming and future Switch games. But hey, I mean, Nintendo does what Nintendo does best, and that's being itself. It never really listens to the fan base all that much. It doesn't care what people think. They're very Japanese in the sense that they do what they do, and the people will come and they will buy. But yeah, that's my opinion. I think they did it the right way, but they needed to do a bit more. They were just missing one or two things. Just, you know, overclock the hardware just a little bit through firmware, and Bob's your uncle. Because a lot of people now, that you can do it, you can jailbreak your Switch and overclock it. Not that I'm recommending you do that if you don't know what you're doing, but you can, and it's not hardware limited at all. So other than the thermal throttling issues with the new docking mode, it probably could help dissipate more heat. Who knows? We'd have to wait till it launches and see what the reports say from the outlets. But I think Nintendo should legitimately think about doing that. I don't agree that they should have upgraded the internal hardware completely, because you wouldn't be able to get one, and it would just divide the fan base way too much, especially with how many units they have and how well they're doing coming off the back of the Wii U over 4 years ago. So yeah, that's my take on the whole Switch situation. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. I'll leave links to all the relevant articles and everything that show price differences and official specs and everything like that. And I'll link to the 2 videos that I'm aware of that Digital Foundry did in detail about overclocking the Switch. It's really, really interesting, really well done, and it really puts things into perspective as what can be done with it. And who knows, if they decided to firmware update to put DLSS on there anyway and upscale it to, I guess, 1080 or from 720 up to 4K somehow, and it can pull it off, that would be great too. But I don't think paying native games built into that chipset on 4K is as possible as everyone else makes it out to be. Anyway guys, that's me for this video. If you're new to the channel and you enjoyed what you saw, please hit the like button. Consider subscribing if you want to see more content, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. See ya.